Welcome to the Tangent Podcast, where we most certainly will get off topic, but that's all part of the journey. So this week's episode is going to be slightly different due to some internet connectivity problems that we were having. This was not a conversation recorded live, but rather is a pre-recorded Blue episode where Anthony and I will be discussing the topic of tea. Thanks so much for your listening, and I hope you guys enjoy it. So to start this conversation off, it might sound kind of dumb, but the easiest, simplest way to begin is just to ask why. Why tea? What drew you to this book? Why is this book even worth reading? How did you begin to study the topic of tea?
So why choose this book, right? Why talk about tea? Well, to start, I need to say that this book has some importance to me. It was a gift from my grandmother, actually, after I came back from China, and I was on a tea kick because I love tea. And not only do I like it just because of how, it has health benefits, it's an acquired taste to those who think, oh, tea is gross, whatever. It is an acquired taste, I will give it that. But there's also a deep and rich history with tea throughout multiple different civilizations. India, China, Japan, even the United States to some degree, that you can learn a lot about a lot of different things just by studying the history of tea.
All right, so what are some of the misconceptions or the myths concerning tea? Its origins, where it comes from, what makes it good, what makes it bad?
Right, so in human history, you always have these myths and these mythos that appear for just about anything that seems like it has a positive or even negative effect on human society. So eclipses are a good example of this. Natural events like hurricanes, storms, those are also good examples of this. And tea is another good example. Humans, because when you drink tea and you consume tea, it has an actual perceivable effect on your body. Humans came up with different myths and different things to attribute that to. As to the origins of tea, the book doesn't go that much into detail as the myths behind that. Instead, it tries to talk about how different monks and holy men attribute tea to allowing you to open up your chakra, your chi, how it brings balance to your inner self. And different proverbs go over this, and there's definitely different mythos surrounding what it actually does, what tea comes from, what this metaphysical effect of tea is on a person. And while there isn't really specific myths attributed or accompanied with these ceremonies, there were tea ceremonies that were done, and there was a specific way to drink tea throughout different cultures that still exist today. As a matter of fact, the invention of porcelain, and then during the Song Dynasty, this romantic period of Chinese tea drinking, as the book calls it, you have different, more elaborate rituals popping up to enjoy, as sometimes is quoted, the celestial beverage of the gods, referring to tea. There are countless different, maybe not countless, but there are a lot of different cultures and different rituals around the drinking of tea that I could go into, but a lot of them are very detailed with very specific things. So like, for example, in certain cultures and certain ceremonies, you have an idol that you pour the first glass of tea over as a way to respect your ancestors. That's something that is sometimes in different tea ceremonies. And I could go over all of them, but it would be very verbose and very distinct to different cultures. Not even just cultures, but also time periods, because these, sometimes starting off as simplistic events, have been changed and have evolved over time when they've transitioned from one culture to another. So, for example, from a Chinese period to a Japanese period, they add things, they take away things, and they are just these constantly evolving but somehow traditional events that you do to consume tea.
Misconceptions and myth aside, where did tea actually come from, and how did it migrate to it being a beverage that's consumed worldwide?
So that's actually a question that I've asked myself personally before reading this book, and I'm sure a lot of people might have thought of, tea. It's a leaf that you put in water and boil it for some reason, and then somehow it has health benefits. And you might think like, why? Who thought of that? Who was the first human to be like, let's try this. Let's boil this leaf juice. Hell yeah. I feel like that's a common thought for people to have, and it's a very valid one at that too. But that is one of the things that the book answers, or at least poses it an answer to the question. And apparently, a lot of anthropologists theorize that most of the prehistoric humans from the species Homo erectus, not Homo sapiens, which is what modern humans are classified as, would have discovered these tea trees in the forests of Yunnan, which is a province in China, and in their quest to discover what parts of the environment are edible, because creatures need to eat, animals need to eat, that includes humans and prehistoric humans, would have probably eaten these out of their curiosity, and they would have found that it would have been a source of invigorating energy. Like if you eat tea, obviously it's not going to do that much for you and it's going to taste terrible, but you might feel the effects of the caffeine that's in them, even without boiling it and extracting it into a fluid, a liquid. Now, having said that, once there was the discovery of fire, they would have tried multiple different things to use these leaves for. One, putting them in water and boiling them, I'm sure they would have boiled lots of things. They could have used it in cooking. Especially if they had some sort of fish that they caught, they could have used it in a recipe for fish. And over time, you go from this food medicine source into tea. So by the time of the Shang or Shang dynasty, apologies if I mispronounced that, which is recorded as 1766 to 1050 BC, tea was being consumed in that same province for its medical properties. Among these medicinal concoctions, there was any sort of host of boiled plants. So it wasn't just like, oh, we'll just throw this tea leaf in there, we'll boil it, oh, this tastes great, there you go, there's tea. They would throw any other kind of plant, seeds, barks, to try to concoct these healing poultices, these healing remedies. And so through trial and error, you would eventually, by the end of the Zhou dynasty, so 1122 to 526 BC, tea trees were known for their use of creating good sources of invigorating beverages, poultices, remedies to ailments. And around that time, that's when you start to see the tea trees in this, not only just the Yunnan province, but the Sichuan province, being used for just a concentrated liquid, no addition of other leaves, herbs, bark, seeds, etc., etc. An obviously famous material used in lots of different dishwares, old pots, coffee mugs, etc. There was a culture to the porcelain because it was invented for tea. The imperial porcelain was sometimes called the celestial porcelain because it had this higher air to it.
Now that we have the origin and the myths and all that stuff covered, what are actual benefits of tea? Why should I drink tea versus a different hot beverage? I'm sure we can think of obvious answers for that, but there are also some less obvious answers as well.
So to start with the obvious, right? Tea has caffeine in it. That's actually what gives tea its bitter taste. And so it is a drink that you could consume if you needed to get more energy, because caffeine has a couple of different benefits. For example, it's good at restricting the veins to help blood flow. And obviously that can lead to things like staying awake, feeling like you have higher energy. It can do things like sometimes it stops some of the receptors that are used for sleep. And so that also is something that makes you feel like you have more energy because you want to stay awake for longer. But that's something that's found in multiple different beverages, and so it could be contested whether or not that is the prime benefit of tea, right? But additionally, there's other things in it like polyphenols. There are different antioxidants. And then there's theanine, which is an amino acid that is sometimes believed to act as the neurotransmitter responsible for relaxation. So tea is something that's supposed to give you more energy, but yet there's somehow this way of feeling relaxed, even though you're supposedly have all of this energy. And theanine is believed to be the cause for that. And the levels of theanine are sometimes even increased or attempted to be decreased to give different effects of the tea. So, for example, in different Japanese gyokuro tea, it's made from leaves that are plucked from shaded tea bushes. And the Japanese believe that the highest amounts of theanine are found in teas from shaded tea bushes. As to what antioxidants do, as a very brief and very high level overview of what antioxidants are for, there are these things in your body called free radicals, and free radicals are known to do lots of different things that disrupt your life and make your life shorter by some amount. And antioxidants are the way of countering that. And so the numerous amounts of antioxidants that are in tea are sometimes theorized to allow the removal of these free radicals and thus extending your life. There's lots of research that's being done on this in terms of how much of an effect the antioxidants have. I would recommend reading into it because it's some interesting stuff. But again, we're not any kind of doctors or food scientists, so we can only comment so much. And I can only say what the book goes into. One thing to note is that different kinds of teas have different levels of these substances, of these antioxidants, and different kinds of antioxidants. And different polyphenols in them as well. So green tea has different levels than black tea / red tea because they're equivalently the same thing. Pu'er, white tea, all of these different kinds, and also what region it's from, could have different levels of these different benefits, these different compounds, I'll say, rather than benefits.
There's that old adage of everything in moderation, which people often use to explain that even doing something good for you, i.e. drinking water, in excess can be harmful to your bodies. So what about tea? Is there a way for you to overdose, for lack of a better word, or consume too much tea to the point where, say, it has an adverse effect on you?
So outside of like really stupid stuff like water poisoning, which only comes from just a gross amount of negligence, the only real downside is caffeine in terms of things that can be consumed too much to be bad. And the book quotes that caffeine is safe for most people at around 0.3 grams per day. And it says that is basically equivalent to 5 full cups of tea brewed at full strength. The only weird quirk to that estimate of 5 cups a day is that tea is weird in that the amount of caffeine that is inside a single given cup of tea has a lot of different things that can determine that. The book quotes a couple of constants, so like the choice of leaf that's plucked, the age of the leaf that's been plucked, and the period during the plant's growth cycle is another one. So, for example, whether it follows a hard pruning, a severe winter kill, a maintenance pruning, or like wind damage, the tea might have a large amount of nutrients in the actual leaf because the plant is trying to recover from this jarring situation. And that might be another reason to account for why there's more caffeine in a specific cup of tea than otherwise. It's kind of untraceable. It's hard to actually determine this stuff, but it might be a reason as to why a cup could have higher amounts of caffeine in it than otherwise. Back to the age of the leaf. So the younger the leaf, is, the higher the amount of caffeine that's in it. The older, typically, the lower amount. So the fourth leaf is also known as like a coarse plucking, may have 30% less caffeine in it than the same branch's bud set. And the bud set is, going back to the choice of leaf, with most flowering plants and other herbs, the emerging bud, that is considered the bud set. And so the bud typically has most of the lifeblood of the plant, or the most of the nutrients that are from the plant, because obviously the plant wants to reproduce. That's how it reproduces, by making sure it has the most nutrients, and so therefore it probably will have the most amount of caffeine in it. As for different brewing techniques that could affect the release of caffeine, the temperature of water is one of them, and the amount of time that the tea leaf is allowed to brew also can affect the amount of caffeine that's in the actual liquid. So if you have water that's, say, too hot or too cold, defined in air quotes because that's kind of hard to put specific numbers on, it's basically a range of the temperature. So the colder the water is, the less caffeine is released. The hotter the water is, the more caffeine is typically released. And one of the things that you'll see in different tea ceremonies in preparation of the tea is you will either brew the tea first and then pour out the first cup and then brew more, or you might brew the tea for longer than, I think 5 minutes is like the technical way of looking at it. That's another way to reduce the amount of caffeine that is in a given cup of tea. So for example, when you first brew the tea, it's thought that most of the caffeine is released then. So then you pour it out and then you go back to brewing more tea, and that will reduce the amount of caffeine that's in the total amount of tea leaves that you have. This is, again, variant off of what kind of tea it is, where the tea is from, when it was picked, all of that kind of stuff too. But it's thought of this way to specifically lower the caffeine content. And again, this is only talking about things that are from the specific tea plant, because I guess I never really touched upon that. So things like ginger tea is from ginger and not the actual tea plant. Camellia sinensis. That's the actual tea plant that's defined scientifically.
This is probably going to be the most controversial thing that I ask you, only because for as many different people there are in the world, there's a different answer for this question. But I'm going to ask it anyway because I like the chaos, I like the drama. Who has the quote-unquote best tea?
Who makes and sells the best tea? That is a very, very hard question to answer. So I'm gonna end up putting a link, or in the description or show notes or whatever, there's going to be a list of a bunch of different companies, because the book has a list of like different companies that are big league tea sellers and have a wide variety. But there's a lot of good, like, depending on where you are, there can be a lot of good local sellers. I don't know. I feel like this is a cop-out answer, but it's less about who makes it and more about how it's made. That's like one of the things that I love the most about tea is like there's so many different options for people. Like if you don't want the really bitter flavor, you can have different lower caffeine variations. There are different kinds of ways to produce tea between like things like matcha and bancha from the Japanese side, or you could have like just traditional Chinese hongcha, which is red tea. You could have like white tea. You could have black, or you could have not black tea. You could have green tea. You could have pu'er. If you like really, really strong, earthy flavors, pu'er is like exactly what you want. Usually it has like a super high caffeine content. If that's also what you're looking for too. You can put honey in your tea. You could have, if you're of the English sorts, you can have English milk tea. There's so many different options. I don't know. That's such a hard question to answer of who makes the best or who makes the best tea. There's like Twinings, I guess is okay. Just don't buy Lipton. That's my answer. My answer is don't buy Lipton. Like any kind of big American tea brand, I would be questionable of. Like Lipton size brand. There are some good American brands, like Perennial Tea Room, Harney and Sons Tasting Room of Seattle and New York, respectively. Red and Green Company are in San Francisco. There's a bunch of like good boba tea shops, because I haven't even touched upon boba tea yet, that have different and interesting flavors. Just you gotta search, you gotta look for it if you want to try to find good tea, and you gotta try stuff. That's about the best of an answer that I can come up with. But having said that, I think that's about all the time that we have for today. Thank you everyone for tuning in and listening to us talk about tea. I hope that maybe you decide to try something new. All different kinds of things you can try, different flavors, different things you can add. You can add from things like honey. You could add, like British people do, and add milk to your tea. I don't know why you would do that. It's kind of weird, but you know, it's okay. You can add brown sugar. You can add all sorts of things to make it so you don't have to have that bitter flavor. Different strains of tea, and I hope that just listening to some of this might inspire you to try something new. Hello, and thank you so much for listening to this episode of the Tangent Podcast. If you want to keep up to date with our schedule or what we're up to off the mic, feel free to follow us on our social media. Episodes of the Tangent Podcast air Fridays, weekly live on our Twitch channel, Realm of Logres, and are posted in podcast form the following Sunday wherever your podcasts are found. We are grateful for all of our listeners because you are the heart of what we do and why we enjoy doing it. Until next time, thank you and have the greatest day.